Before we begin tonight's history documentary, take a moment to gently support the channel. If you enjoyed these long, quiet journeys into the past, please subscribe. It helps us continue making more calming stories for you to drift off to. And if you'd like, share in the comments where and when you're listening from. We always love to know. Asterisk in the middle of the 6th century. Long before the streets of Constantinople filled with the sounds of mourning, the story began in a quieter, almost unnoticed way. Alexandria, the ancient Egyptian port city that had long been one of the lifelines of the Byzantine Empire, was bustling with its usual routines. The markets were busy, the warehouses full, and the ships heavy with grain destined for the heart of the empire. The Nile had once again fed not just Egypt, but all of Byzantium. Few could imagine that this same grain, so vital for survival, would soon become one of the earliest carriers of something unseen, something silent, something that would creep into the fabric of daily life. Alexandria was no ordinary city. Founded by Alexander the Great and reshaped under Roman and Byzantine authority, it had always been a meeting point of cultures, a place where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and later Christian traditions mixed. Its docks stretched endlessly, filled with ships from across the Mediterranean. Grain barges from the Nile Delta were loaded and then ferried to larger ships bound for Constantinople. Day after day, workers carried sacks, secured ropes, and patched sails. For most, the work was monotonous, dusty, back-breaking labor that sustained the empire, but was rarely celebrated. Yet in those ordinary tasks lay the pathway for something extraordinary. The first appearance of plague in Byzantine lands. The plague, later called the Plague of Justinian, is believed by modern historians and scientists to have been a strain of Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would centuries later cause the Black Death in Europe. But in the 540s, no one in Alexandria could name such a thing. Disease was not seen as bacterial, but divine, mysterious, or simply inevitable. People lived with fevers, dysentery, and infections as part of ordinary existence. Ships brought not just grain, but rats and fleas-noticed passengers that scurried in shadows, feeding on spilled kernels and hiding in damp wooden holds. To the dock workers, these small animals were background noise, as unremarkable as the seagulls that swooped overhead. And so the ships sailed, carrying grain to feed Constantinople's population of nearly 500,000. Along with that grain came the fleas that carried plague. Yet, before Constantinople felt its impact, Alexandria itself would begin to notice the whispers of change. Chronicles suggest that it was in Egypt that the pestilence first took root in Byzantine lands. Although it may have traveled from as far as East Africa or India, carried along trade routes that stretched across oceans and deserts. However, it came. Once it arrived in Egypt, the conditions were perfect. Dense cities, busy ports, and countless opportunities for the disease to travel. Life in Alexandria at this time was a careful balance of order and disorder. Grain taxes collected from Egyptian farmers were stored in massive granaries before being shipped north. Bureaucrats kept meticulous records, tallying amounts and ensuring quotas were met. Farmers, after months of labor under the heat of the Nile sun, brought their harvests to the city, hoping to pay their taxes and keep enough for their families. This cycle had gone on for centuries, largely unchanged, tying the fate of Byzantium cities to the rhythm of the Nile floods. But even this well-oiled system could not account for what was about to unfold. At first, there were simply more funerals. In Egypt, death was common enough that a few extra burials caused little alarm. Priests recited their prayers, families mourned, and bodies were lowered into the earth. But soon, those funerals multiplied. Whole households seemed to vanish within weeks. Dock workers fell sick, unable to finish their shifts. Grain shipments were delayed as sailors collapsed in their hammocks. Doctors limited in their knowledge and bound by traditions that mixed Greek medical theory with Christian prayer were powerless. We prescribed baths, herbs, or isolation, but nothing seemed to slow the advance. In those days, no one understood contagion as we do now. Families cared for the sick without protection, sharing food, clothing, and bedding. Priests anointed the dying with oil, unaware that their touch only spread the sickness further. Case, some thought the Nile had brought a curse, its waters perhaps, poisoned by unseen forces. Others believed that Alexandria was being punished for sins, that God's wrath had descended upon the city. And still others, more practical, wondered if bad grain or corrupt officials were somehow to blame. Explanations multiplied, but none stopped the funerals from continuing. The daily rhythm of Alexandria began to change. Markets emptied as people stayed indoors. Ships left port half-manned, their captains desperate to meet their obligations, but fearful of losing entire crews. The bureaucrats of the grain office struggled to balance records with reality. Taxes unpaid because farmers were dead, warehouses left unguarded, and shipments delayed. The empire relied on this grain. Without it, Constantinople would starve. And yet, the very system that kept the capital alive was now entangled with death. By the time reports reached Constantinople, the scale was still unclear to the officials. At the imperial court, news from Egypt often arrived slowly and was buried among endless documents. Among sailors and merchants, rumors spread more quickly. They whispered of strange swellings, of men and women who died within days of their first fever. They spoke of villages where the fields were overgrown because no one remained to harvest them. Still, too many in Constantinople. These were distant tales, exaggerated perhaps, and easy to dismiss. Alexandria had always been a city of stories, a place where fact and rumor mixed freely, and yet the truth was unavoidable. Something new had entered the empire, carried on the same ships that had long sustained it. The plague moved, not with armies or edicts, but with grain, sacks, and flea bites, slipping silently into the fabric of daily life. It would not remain confined to Alexandria. The same docks that bustled with life now hummed with the beginnings of death. Sailors carried it onward, merchants unknowingly spread it, and soon the greatest city of the empire would face what Egypt had already begun to endure. As we pause here, standing on the docks of Alexandria, the question lingers: when grain and death travel together, can an empire continue to feed itself without poisoning its own heart? The ships that left Alexandria in the early 540s carried more than grain. To the sailors, the voyage was routine. They hoisted sails, checked ropes, and steered by stars, repeating practices learned from fathers and grandfathers. To them, journey north across the Mediterranean was an ordinary act of survival and duty, delivering food that kept the capital alive, but hidden in the shadows of the cargo holds beneath piles of wheat and barley. Another cargo, sturge rats and fleas, carrying the seeds of pestilence. For centuries, the grain fleet had been the lifeline of Constantinople. Without Egypt's produce, the capital's 500,000 inhabitants would not eat. It was a system perfected by Roman emperors and inherited by Justinian. Every year, fleets sailed the length of the eastern Mediterranean, their arrival timed so that granaries in the capital would never empty. Bureaucrats measured, counted, and documented each shipment with a precision that gave the empire stability. And yet, within this well-lorded system, a flaw lay invisible. Neither bureaucrat nor sailor could see the sickness waiting to unfold. When the first 6 sailors staggered ashore in Cyprus, it hardly made the news of the day. Ports always saw illness. Sailors often fell victim to fevers from foreign lands. Some called it Egyptian fever, others thought it the Nile's curse, but Cyprus was only a stopover. The grain ships did not remain, they pressed on, carrying both food and disease further north. By the time they reached Antioch, the signs were undeniable. Antioch, a grand city of trade, had already known hardship. Just a few years earlier, in 526, it had been shattered by an earthquake that killed tens of thousands. Survivors rebuilt with stubborn determination. But now, as sailors brought grain to its docks, whispers of a new threat emerged. Men unloading cargo collapsed by midday. Swellings appeared in armpits and groins, painful lumps that grew and blackened. Families reported fevers that left their kin gasping for air, then silent. Within days, Antioch, still recovering from stone and rubble, now faced an enemy that could not be rebuilt away. Merchants were quick to adapt. Some stopped trading with Egypt altogether, fearing what came with the ships. Others pressed on, thinking profit might outweigh the risk, carrying goods into Anatolia, Syria, and beyond. With every journey, the unseen plague found new hosts, new ports, and new streets to inhabit. Constantinople remained, at first, untouched. Reports reached the capital. Meanwhile, ordinary life continued in the capital. Bakers sold bread made from Egyptian grain. Bureaucrats processed records of imports and taxes. Families prayed in new churches that gleamed with mosaics. But beneath this normality, the seeds had already been sown. Ships arrived daily, their hulls echoing with the skitter of rats, their sacks alive with the fleas that carried death. The same grain that sustained the empire's heart now threatened to choke it. Chroniclers of the time would later describe the first days of plague in Constantinople. They did not know its name nor its cause, but they recorded the symptoms. Fevers that burned uncontrollably, swellings in the lymph nodes that grew grotesque, delirium, blackened skin, and sudden death. To the city's physicians, trained in the traditions of Galen and Hippocrates, this was beyond comprehension. They spoke of imbalances of humors, of corrupted air, of divine punishment. Remedies ranged from bloodletting to prayer, from herbs to isolation. None worked, and yet, before Constantinople faced its crisis, the countryside bore the brunt. Villages along the Nile Delta emptied, harvests were left uncollected, and taxes went unpaid. Along the coast of Syria, towns fell silent, their markets bare. Fishermen vanished from harbors. Farmers stopped coming to cities with their produce. The empire, so carefully bound together by trade routes and grain fleets, now found that these very connections spread weakness instead of strength. What is most striking in these years is not just the death, but the silence of records. For an empire so proud of its bureaucracy, so dependent on writing and tallying, the gaps are telling. In papyri from Egypt, tax rolls suddenly break off. In city registers, names of officials disappear mid-page, as if the hand that wrote them never finished the line. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of abandoned houses, sometimes with possessions still inside, suggesting families who left in haste or perished without heirs. These small, silent traces tell more than grand chronicles ever could. Even religion could not provide clarity. Bishops preached of sin and repentance. Some declared the plague a punishment for heresies that had divided the church. Others said it was a trial of faith. Monks withdrew into the desert, believing solitude offered protection. But wherever they went, the plague followed. It did not respect doctrine, wealth, or piety. Emperor or beggar, bishop or dockworker, all could be struck by the late 540s. The empire stood at a crossroads. Grain still arrived, and with it, sustenance. The cost was growing clear. Rumors became reality. Constantinople itself would not be spared. Chroniclers would soon record bodies piled in the streets, mass graves dug outside the city walls, and an emperor struck down by the very sickness that ravaged his people. In the years just before, the question lingered quietly. Could an empire built on order withstand something so uncontrollable? And so the grain ships continued to sail. Fleets left Alexandria with their cargo, unaware that each voyage carried not only bread for the hungry, but also the seeds of collapse. The empire depended on them too much to stop. And because it did not stop, the plague had all it needed to spread from one end of the Mediterranean to the other. We pause here, with the ships still at sea, sails stretched against the wind, rats stirring below deck, and Constantinople's granaries filling. The question rises, when sustenance and sickness are inseparable, what choice does a city or an empire really have? Asterisk, by the spring of 542, the empire's great capital Constantinople stood, unaware at the edge of a catastrophe. Life inside its towering walls carried on with the routines that had defined the city for generations. Bakers rose early, kneading bread made from Egyptian wheat. Artisans hammered bronze, stitched cloth, and polished icons in workshops that spilled onto narrow lanes. Bureaucrats filled the endless halls of the imperial palace with the scratching of pens and the murmur of clerks. And in the city's heart, Hagia Sophia glittered with fresh mosaics. Its massive dome, a statement of Justinian's power and divine favor. Yet, beneath this hum of daily life, science began to appear small at first, easy to dismiss. A dock worker here, a sailor there, a fever that burned hotter than usual, a swelling in the armpit or groin that grew to the size of an egg. Physicians offered their remedies, bloodletting, poultices, and herbal concoctions. Priests prayed over the afflicted. Still, the sick worsened. Families whispered of a new fever, different from the usual fluxes of the season. Rumors spread faster than physicians could contain them. When the pestilence finally revealed its true scale, it did so with terrifying speed. In a matter of weeks, the city of 500,000 found itself drowning in illness. Contemporary chroniclers, most famously Procopius, recorded scenes of horror, bodies piled in the streets, unattended for days, because no one dared to approach. Carts carrying the dead through alleyways. Monas's graves dug hastily outside the walls. The sheer number of victims overwhelmed the city's capacity to bury them. Officials tried to organize burial parties, but soon even the gravediggers succumbed. In desperation, corpses were left in houses, stacked in courtyards, or loaded onto boats and cast into the sea. For Emperor Justinian, the crisis was not distant, it was personal. In the summer of 542, he himself contracted the disease. Fever gripped him, and swellings appeared on his body. Courtiers whispered that the emperor would die, that God had abandoned him. Procopius, never sympathetic to Justinian, would later write that the emperor survived by sheer chance, though many believed it was divine intervention. His survival mattered deeply. The empire, already shaken, might have splintered entirely had its ruler perished at that moment. But the city around him was less fortunate. The population shrank drastically. Some estimates, though debated, suggest that tens of thousands died within a matter of months. The city's food supply faltered not because grain stopped arriving, but because there were fewer hands to unload it, bake it, and distribute it. Shops closed, workshops fell silent, and fields beyond the city lay untended. Even the mighty army meant to guard the empire's frontiers could not escape. Soldiers sickened, campaigns stalled, and victories turned to ashes. The atmosphere in Constantinople shifted from bustling to hushed. Bells tolled, not for celebrations, but for burials. Priests walked through empty streets, chanting prayers, their voices echoing against stone. The hippodrome, once alive with cheers and races, stood abandoned. Markets thinned and prices rose as fewer goods arrived from the countryside. Every corner of the city bore the mark of absence. And yet, even amid devastation, daily routines persisted in fragments. Some still fetched water from fountains. Some still lit candles before icons. Bureaucrats, remarkably, continued to record names, taxes, and decrees, even as those very officials disappeared from the lists. This stubborn persistence reflected something deeper: the empire's reliance on continuity, even when continuity was impossible. The plague, however, did not strike all equally. Wealthier families sometimes fled to country estates, though many carried the sickness with them. The poor, crammed into wooden houses near the docks, suffered the worst, with little means of escape. Foreign merchants, caught in the city when the outbreak peaked, later carried tales of horror back to their homelands, spreading not just the disease, but the story of Constantinople's suffering. As the months wore on, the epidemic eventually slowed. Death had claimed so many that the plague, for a time, had fewer hosts to infect. Survivors emerged, shaken, grieving, yet alive. Some bore scars, both physical and emotional. Families were smaller, workshops emptier, but life resumed because it had to. K-ships still arrived, prayers were still said, and imperial decrees still echoed through the palace halls. But nothing was quite the same. The city would recover, but not fully. Its population had been reduced, its confidence shaken. The memory of sudden death lingered, reshaping how people viewed the empire, the emperor, and the fragility of daily life. Historians now, long before Constantinople's streets filled with bodies, its docks had already begun to whisper of change. The city, resting on the edge of the Bosporus, lived and breathed through its harbors. To feed 500,000 inhabitants, the empire depended on the steady rhythm of ships docking, unloading, and departing. The sea lanes from Alexandria, Antioch, and countless smaller ports converged here, their sails dotting the horizon like constant reminders of empire-wide interconnection. Harbors themselves were engineering marvels: the Prosporian, the Neorian, and above all, the great Theodosian harbor in the southwest of the city. Each bustled with life. Cranes creaked as heavy cargo was lifted from holds. Dock workers shouted commands in Greek, Latin, and Coptic. Merchants haggled over the price of goods, while tax officials, seated behind wooden desks, quoted every sack of grain, amphora of oil, and crate of spices. To an outsider, it must have looked chaotic, but to those who worked here every day, it was a system of order, one that had endured through centuries of empire. And yet, by the early 540s, something about the docks was changing. Sailors from Egypt spoke in hushed tones of sickness in their homelands. They told of funerals in Alexandria, of whole villages along the Nile where no one came to harvest. Many in Constantinople dismissed such talk as exaggeration. Egypt was far away, its troubles often inflated in sailors' tales. But dock workers who loaded grain ships noticed the unease. Some sailors coughed incessantly, others carried fevers that left them pale and weak. Few never rose from their hammocks again. Their bodies carried off quietly before anyone asked too many questions. Rats, always present in harbors, multiplied unnoticed. They thrived in the food-rich environment of Constantinople's docks. Grain spilled from sacks provided them with endless meals, while the wooden piers and warehouses gave shelter. Fleas, unseen, rode their backs, carrying the unseen bacterium that had already begun to reshape the empire's destiny. No one paid attention to them. To dock workers, rats were as ordinary as the smell of salt air or the creak of ropes. The bureaucrats, meanwhile, were focused on records. Every grain shipment was weighed, counted, and assigned to the city's distribution system. Bread, sold at state-subsidized prices, was vital to keeping Constantinople's vast population fed and quiet. Without it, riots could erupt, as they had in earlier decades. The government watched closely for any disruptions, but the threat they anticipated was shortage, not sickness. Long as the granaries filled and the bakeries turned out loaves. They believed the system was secure. The people of Constantinople themselves were largely unaware. Life in the city was noisy, crowded, and full of distractions. Crowds thronged the hippodrome for chariot races. Processions filled the streets on feast days. Markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the empire. Silk from China, spices from India, wine from Syria. The plague that had begun in Egypt seemed as distant as desert sands. To the average citizen, the docks were simply a guarantee that life would continue as it always had. Food on the table, work in the workshops, sermons in the churches. Still, the warning signs grew harder to ignore. By the time the first wave of sickness reached the harbors, it was already too late to contain. Dock workers began to vanish from their posts. Captains reported crews cut in half before reaching Constantinople. Grain shipments, though still arriving, came with fewer hands to unload them. Bureaucrats noticed delays, but they chalked them up to poor management or bad weather. Few connected the missing workers to the rumors of plague in Egypt and Syria. The rhythm of the docks slowed. Where once cranes swung constantly and carts rattled over cobblestones, now there were pauses, gaps where no one came to unload, where captains waited for men who never arrived. The silence was subtle at first, like a skipped heartbeat, but those who worked there every day felt it. The harbors that had once been alive with sound now carried undertones of unease. Merchants, too, began to worry. Some found their goods quarantined unofficially by nervous customers. Others saw sailors refuse to board ships bound for Alexandria, fearing what awaited there. Few daring traders sought to profit, buying grain cheaply from desperate Egyptian farmers and selling it at higher prices in the capital. Port profit was fleeting. As the sickness moved closer, even the boldest merchants began to question the cost of their trade. By the time the first true outbreak struck Constantinople, the harbors had already transformed. They were still busy, still filled with ships, but the old sense of stability was gone. Whispers of fear clung to the air as tightly as the smell of fish and tar. And when the plague finally broke into the city itself, the docks, once symbols of connection and plenty, became gateways of death. In these first moments, when the city still clung to its old routines, an uneasy question began to rise among those who labored by the water. What happens to a city when the very lifeline that feeds it also carries its destruction? When Constantinople's citizens thought of their city, they thought of grandeur. Hagia Sophia's golden dome, the hippodrome's races, the bustling markets of the mazy, the orderly power of the imperial palace. But none of these marvels could exist without the docks. The harbors were the lungs of the capital, breathing in supplies from every corner of the empire. Grain, olive oil, wine, fish, spices, timber, all arrived by sea. And in return, the empire's coins, silk, and crafted goods flowed outward. For decades, this system had worked so reliably that few questioned it. Every year, grain fleets from Egypt timed their arrivals so precisely that Constantinople's granaries rarely sat empty. Every week, carts pulled food from the docks through the city gates, supplying bakers who turned out loaves for hundreds of thousands. Every day, tax collectors and customs officials logged transactions in neat columns of ink. Waste, it was a rhythm that gave life stability. But in 522, that rhythm broke. At first, it was small interruptions. A ship arriving late, its captain apologizing for ill winds, a warehouse half-staffed because laborers had fallen sick, sailors stumbling ashore, pale and fevered, dying within days. These were disruptions, but not yet collapse. The system bent under the strain, but it did not break. Not yet. Soon, however, the interruptions grew too large to ignore. Ship after ship arrived undermanned, with crews reporting sickness that had killed half their number before reaching port. Some ships drifted into harbor, with only a few survivors left to tie the ropes. Grain still filled the holds, but the air carried a stench of death. Dock workers, once eager to unload, grew hesitant. Some refused to touch the cargo. Others demanded extra pay for the risk. Rats scurried more boldly than ever, feeding on spilled grain, darting across ropes, slipping into warehouses. No one realized that the fleas on their backs carried the true threat. The officials in charge of the docks tried to maintain order. They wrote edicts demanding that unloading continue, that grain reach the bakeries without delay. They posted guards to ensure carts left the harbor gates. But guards, too, fell sick. Clerks disappeared from their desks. The very machinery of bureaucracy that had kept the docks functioning began to falter. The silence deepened. Cranes stood idle, their ropes swaying in the wind. Ships lingered at anchor, waiting for men who never came. Warehouses filled unevenly, with some standing full while others lay abandoned. The bustling noise of shouts, clattering carts, and hammering faded into echoes. For ordinary citizens, the change at the docks meant empty bread stalls. Lines grew longer, prices rose. Days bakeries had no loaves at all. Hunger joined sickness, each amplifying the other. Crowds muttered angrily, yet even in their anger, they feared the source. They knew now the plague came with the ships, yet without those ships, the city could not eat. To cut off the docks was to starve. To keep them open was to invite death. Merchants fared little better. Their warehouses overflowed with goods they could not sell. Foreign traders found themselves trapped, unable to sail home because no crew would risk leaving port. Many of them sickened too, their wealth offering no shield. Markets that once displayed silks, spices, and perfumes grew bare. The surviving sellers, too cautious to linger in public spaces. The plague struck without order, claiming dock workers, sailors, merchants, soldiers, and priests alike. It left behind streets littered with the dead, carts piled high with bodies creaking from the harbors toward hastily dug pits. Chroniclers wrote of corpses thrown into the sea when burial ground ran out. Boats carrying the dead away as quietly as they had once carried grain. Through it all, the docks remained the entry point, the artery through which sickness continued to flow. Every ship that arrived brought more than food. It brought new waves of contagion, spreading further into the city's quarters. The very success of Constantinople's lifeline now ensured its devastation. And yet, amid collapse, fragments of the old rhythm persisted. Some ships still docked. Some workers still hauled grain. Some bakers still managed to turn wheat into bread. Survival demanded that the docks remain open, even as they became sites of fear. So the city lived in contradictions. The harbors, once its pride, were now places of dread. Every mast on the horizon was both hope and terror. Hope for sustenance, terror for the plague it surely carried. We leave this moment standing by the water, where waves lap against stone and ships creak at anchor, and the air is heavy with the smell of grain, tar, and death. And we must ask, how long can a city endure when the very lifeline that feeds it has become the instrument of its ruin? Asterisk. By the height of the outbreak in 542, Constantinople's harbors had become places of dread. What had once been the heart of the city's prosperity now stood as its most visible wound. The docks were no longer filled with the cries of workers, the creak of cranes, and the rumble of carts. Instead, they were haunted by silence, broken only by the occasional splash of waves against hulls and the distant tolling of church bells for the dead. Ships still arrived, but what they brought was different. Grain-filled holds continued to dock, but so too did sickness. Entire crews had perished at sea, their bodies left where they had fallen, stiffened on deck or in hammocks. Those few who survived staggered onto land, only to collapse within days. Dock workers, once the bustling force of the city, had been thinned by the plague. Some had died, others had fled, and many of those who remained were too weak to labor. The unloading of ships slowed to a crawl. Cargo rotted in holds. Rats fattened on spilled grain, and the harbor stank with the mingled smells of decay and neglect. Bureaucrats, who once tallied every sack of wheat and every amphora of oil, could no longer keep pace. Registers broke off mid-page. Names of workers were struck out, never to return. Warehouses, once tightly monitored, were abandoned in confusion. In some cases, hungry citizens raided them, breaking open sealed doors in desperation. The authorities tried to stop them, but guards too had fallen sick. Discipline collapsed alongside. The records that had once ordered the docks with such precision, the silence of the harbors mirrored the silence of the city itself. Carts that should have rolled daily from the gates to bakeries stood idle. Bread lines grew longer, the loaves smaller, and hunger gnawed at Constantinople as surely as plague. For some, famine struck before fever. For others, fever arrived before famine. Either way, the docks were at the center of both. The very sight of a ship's mast on the horizon became a paradox. Citizens watching from the seawalls felt both relief and terror. Relief because food was coming. Terror because with that food came new waves of plague. No one knew how to break the cycle. Shutting the harbors would mean starvation. Keeping them open meant death. The empire's lifeline had become its greatest liability. Chroniclers describe bodies left unburied at the docks, too many to remove. When pits filled, corpses were loaded onto barges and pushed out to sea, floated back to shore. An awful reminder of the futility of the effort. Others sank, their presence marked only by the absence of fishers, too afraid to cast their nets in waters they now believed cursed foreign traders. Once eager to fill Constantinople's markets, now dreaded its harbors. Some tried to flee, but ships sailed short-handed, or not at all, as no one dared crew them. Others were stranded, forced to watch as their goods spoiled and their companions died. The international lifeblood of the city had been severed, leaving Constantinople strangely insular, cut off from the world, even as it still sat at the crossroads of empire. And yet, the empire's survival demanded that the docks remain open, even in collapse. The state ordered the unloading of ships, often with enslaved laborers pressed into service when dock workers were gone. Priests were sent to bless the waters, hoping divine words might cleanse what human hands could not. But prayers, like edicts, failed to halt the plague. The transformation of the harbors was complete. What had once been the proud symbols of order, feeding and enriching the empire, now stood as monuments to helplessness. Empty cranes, idle ships, abandoned warehouses, and the silence of absence spoke louder than any proclamation. As the plague finally receded after months of devastation, survivors returned to the docks. They found structures still standing, but a system broken. Where once thousands had labored, now only handfuls remained. Where once goods from every corner of the Mediterranean had flowed freely, now the warehouses echoed with emptiness. Recovery was possible, but the memory of collapse lingered in later years. The plague would return in cycles, but the first outbreak at the harbors remained the most haunting. It taught Constantinople a lesson and never fully forgot, that even the mightiest city, supplied by the richest empire, could be undone not by armies, not by sieges, but by the silent arrival of sickness on the very ships that gave it life. And so we leave the harbors of Constantinople, standing quiet after the storm, and we are left to wonder when the lifeline of an empire can turn against it so completely. what can any city truly rely upon for survival? Asterisk, in the year 541, when rumors of sickness began drifting from Alexandria and Antioch, Emperor Justinian I stood at the pinnacle of his reign. From the great palace overlooking the Bosporus, he commanded a realm that stretched from the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of Armenia, from the coasts of Italy to the fortresses of North Africa. He had survived riots, rebuilt his capital's most sacred monument, and launched campaigns to restore Rome's lost western provinces. To his subjects, he was both feared and admired, a man whose vision of empire seemed boundless. Justinian had been on the throne since 527, and in those years, he had transformed Constantinople. After the devastating Nico riots of 532, when flames consumed much of the city and thousands died in the Hippodrome, Justinian rebuilt with grandeur. Out of the ashes rose Hagia Sophia, its vast dome unlike anything the empire had seen before. It was more than a church. It was a statement that Justinian's rule was blessed, unshaken, and eternal. His codification of Roman law, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was another such statement. Tweege, meant to bring order to centuries of legal confusion. His armies, led by generals like Belisarius, reclaimed Carthage, Sicily, and Rome itself. For the first time in generations, it seemed the old Roman world might be restored. And yet, amid this splendor, Justinian was not a young man anymore. Born in 482 in the Balkans, he had risen from modest origins, elevated by his uncle, Emperor Justin I by the 540s. He was nearing his 60s, his health already strained by decades of rule, responsibility, and ceaseless ambition. Those who saw him noted his sharp mind and restless energy, but also the weariness of a man carrying the burdens of empire. Into this setting came the plague. At first, Justinian may have thought it distant. Reports from Egypt and Syria were troubling. Yes, but such regions had long been prone to famine, earthquakes, or outbreaks of disease. Constantinople, so carefully provisioned and fortified, seemed secure. But when the sickness entered the capital in 542, it did not spare the palace. Justinian continued his routines as long as he could. He presided over councils, heard petitions, and issued decrees. He was, above all, a ruler who believed in order, and to abandon duty was unthinkable. But the plague struck indiscriminately. Courtiers fell ill, guards collapsed at their posts, clerks vanished from their desks. The palace, usually filled with the hum of officials, echoed with absence. Priests came daily to pray in its chapels, their chants mingling with the muffled sounds of grief from the city beyond. Then the emperor himself sickened. Chroniclers speak of him struck by sudden fever, his body marked with the same swellings that had terrified his people. His face grew pale, his movements slowed, and his voice, once sharp in command, faltered. Physicians rushed to his side, applying the same remedies they offered to others: bloodletting, herbs, ointments, baths. None could guarantee recovery. For days, Justinian lingered between life and death. The empire held its breath. An emperor was more than a man. He was the linchpin of order. If Justinian died, especially in the midst of crisis, the consequences could be catastrophic. Factions in the court, long at odds, might tear one another apart. Provinces, newly reconquered, might revolt. Enemies at the borders, Persians, Goths, and others, would seize their chance. The survival of one man suddenly meant the survival of the empire. Theodora, Justinian's empress, remained at his side. Once an actress, later the most powerful woman in the empire, she had already proven her resolve during the Nika riots, when she refused to flee the city and convinced her husband to fight back. Now, she guided the palace in his illness, ensuring decrees still bore his name and projecting strength to the people. To admit the emperor was near death would invite collapse, so the palace walls kept their secrets, even as the city beyond them filled with corpses. Justinian's illness was severe. Some chroniclers suggested he hovered near death for weeks. Priests prayed over him, doctors bled him, servants whispered rumors for Constantinople. The emperor's illness was a mirror of its own fragility. The people saw that even the man who claimed God's favor could be struck down like anyone else. Wealth, power, and proximity to sacred spaces offered no protection. If Justinian could fall sick, what safety was there for a dock worker, a baker, or a child? In this way, the emperor's brush with death became part of the larger story of the plague. His survival gave hope to some, who saw it as proof that the empire still had divine favor. To others, it was troubling, a sign that the empire's fate hung by the thinnest of threads, that even its strongest pillar could crack. And as the emperor lay in bed, drifting between fever and lucidity, the city beyond his palace walls faced its darkest days. The harbors silenced, the markets emptied, the streets filled with the dead. So we leave this moment with a question. When even the emperor, the most powerful man in the known world, lay helpless before the same unseen enemy as his subjects, what did it mean for the future of an empire already stretched to its limits? Asterisk, when word first spread that Justinian had fallen ill, it was carried in whispers. Court attendants, clerks, and guards spoke cautiously, for to question the emperor's strength was dangerous. Yet, outside the palace walls, rumors swelled like floodwaters. Some said the emperor had already died, and the government concealed it to prevent riots. Others believed his sickness was divine punishment, proof that even the most powerful mortal could not escape God's judgment. In a city where tens of thousands lay dead or dying, the thought that the emperor himself shared their fate gave shape to despair. Inside the palace, however, life had not stopped. Empress Theodora held her ground, just as she had years earlier. During the Nico riots, she issued orders in Justinian's name, preserved the appearance of imperial control, and ensured that court officials remained at their posts. Case, those who thought to exploit the emperor's illness for their own gain quickly learned that Theodora was as unyielding in crisis as she had ever been. Justinian's survival was not assured. 4 days, fever consumed him. Physicians drew blood, applied poultices, and recited prayers in shrines within the palace. They invoked the wisdom of Galen, the traditions of Hippocrates, and the blessings of the Christian God. Yet, their remedies were powerless. The emperor's recovery, when it came, seemed almost miraculous. After weeks of weakness, his fever broke. The swellings receded, and he began to rise from his bed. Slowly, unsteadily, Justinian returned to the world of the living. For his subjects, the news carried mixed meaning. Some rejoiced, declared his survival a sign that the empire still enjoyed divine favor. Preached that Constantinople had been tested, and its ruler had endured the trial. But others whispered darker interpretations. Procopius, ever critical of the emperor, would later suggest that Justinian's life was spared not by God's mercy, but by some unnatural force, as if hinting that the emperor was a kind of plague himself, visited upon the empire. Within the palace, survival shifted the balance of power. Theodora's role as regent during her husband's illness strengthened her influence. Already formidable, she emerged even more respected, her authority unquestioned by those who had once doubted her origins. She had ruled in his absence, and she had done so with firmness. For some, this strengthened the empire's stability. For others, it was unsettling, a reminder that the imperial couple's partnership was as central to politics as any general or bishop. Beyond the palace walls, Constantinople still reeled. Bodies filled trenches outside the city. Entire neighborhoods stood abandoned. Trade slowed to a trickle. To the common citizen, Justinian's recovery seemed almost irrelevant compared to the hunger and grief of daily life. Yet, the emperor's return had a symbolic weight. The empire had not lost its ruler. The throne still had a voice. And in a time when divine judgment seemed written into every grave, the emperor's survival gave people something, however fragile, to cling to. Still, suspicion lingered. Why had Justinian survived when so many had not? Why had God spared him, yet taken priests, monks, and children in equal measure? Some answered that it was because the empire could not survive without its ruler. Others claimed it was proof that suffering was not punishment for sin, but a mystery beyond human understanding. In the sermons of the time, we find both voices. One praising God for the emperor's endurance, the other warning that his survival might only delay the empire's reckoning. Justinian himself was changed. Though he returned to rule, he did so with a shadow behind him. He had stared death in the face. He knew the empire was not invincible, and that no fortification, no law code, no campaign of conquest could shield it from forces unseen. His decrees after his recovery took on a different tone, less focused on glory, more on order and survival. He rebuilt walls, strengthened fortresses, and sought to reassert stability. Yet the plague, having already torn through his capital, continued to linger, returning in waves that no policy could prevent. The palace chronicles record fewer lavish ceremonies in the years immediately after. The empire still had wealth, still projected power, but Justinian himself seemed more withdrawn, more cautious. He had survived, but he had not triumphed. His survival was not victory. It was reprieve. And so, Constantinople carried on, led by a ruler who had been touched by the same sickness as his people. But the question remained in every corner of the empire: had Justinian been spared as a sign of hope, or as a warning that the empire's fate rested on a thread so thin it might snap at any moment? Asterisk. When Justinian rose from his sick bed in the summer of 542, Constantinople had already been transformed. Streets that once roared with merchants and charioteers now echoed with silence. Entire neighborhoods had been emptied. Mass graves marked the hills outside the city, where carts had dumped thousands of corpses. The smell of burning incense and lime clung to the air as citizens tried to mask the odor of decay. For many, emperor survival seemed almost unreal, a spark of order in a world collapsing into chaos. Yet, survival came with its own consequences. Justinian was never quite the same again. Chroniclers remarked that he returned thinner, more reserved, his once commanding presence dimmed by illness. He still ruled, still issued laws and commanded armies, but something in him had shifted. He had faced the same pestilence as his subjects and survived, but in surviving, he carried the shadow of fragility. His reign after 542 was marked less by grand vision and more by the struggle to maintain stability in a world scarred by plague. One of his first concerns was continuity. The empire had nearly lost its ruler, and with him, its unity. To prevent such a crisis again, Justinian reinforced the central role of the imperial office. Edicts emphasized loyalty to the throne, and the bureaucracy was tightened further. Yet, the plague undermined every effort. Tax records broke off where officials had died. Governors reported provinces half empty, villages abandoned, and fields gone fallow. The machinery of government, so carefully ordered in Justinian's codes, now stumbled like a wounded body. Religion, too, absorbed the shock. Priests filled their sermons with interpretations of the emperor's illness. Some called it proof that the empire was under divine trial, that Justinian himself had been tested and found worthy. Others warned that it was a reminder of mortality, that no emperor, however great, could escape the hand of God. Theodora, ever pragmatic ensured that prayers for the emperor's recovery were recorded and spread, turning his survival into a story of divine mercy. But among the people, doubts lingered. If God had spared Justinian, why had he not spared their families, their children, their neighbors? The sermons soothed, but they did not answer. The plague also reshaped the empire's external ambitions. Before 542, Justinian's campaigns had stretched across the Mediterranean. His generals had recalled for the people of Constantinople. The emperor's survival was a reminder that history does not end with catastrophe. Even in the face of pestilence, states adapt, rulers endure, and societies find ways to live on. But it was also a reminder of limits. No law code, no army, no monument could shield even the most powerful man from illness. Power could command armies, rebuild cities, and codify laws. But it could not stop a flea from biting or a body from fevering. In this paradox lay the lasting lesson of Justinian's illness. The emperor survived, but the empire was changed forever. The plague had entered his bloodstream, and it would never truly leave. It returned in waves for decades, sometimes lighter, sometimes heavier, each time reshaping lives and policies. Justinian's brush with death had shown that empires like men could fall ill, and though they might endure, they could never again claim invulnerability. So we leave this story with the image of an emperor once untouchable, rising unsteadily from his bed while his city mourned around him. His survival was both a victory and reminder. Victory, because the empire had not yet fallen. Reminder, because power itself could not banish death. And the question whispered in the minds of his people was simple, yet profound. If even Justinian could be brought so low, what hope was there for the rest of them? Asterisk, when plague descended on Constantinople in 542, death came not in trickles, but in floods. First, families tried to manage as they always had. When a loved one died, relatives washed the body, wrapped it in cloth, and carried it to church for prayers before burial. Priests performed rites, neighbors joined in mourning, and the body was lowered into the earth with solemn dignity. But as the weeks dragged on and the number of dead swelled, these familiar rituals became impossible. Death outpaced the living. Families who once carried one body soon found themselves with two, then three, then entire households lying lifeless. It was here, in this dark transformation, that a new kind of work became essential. The work of those who dealt with death on a scale the city had never seen before. They were the gravediggers and corpse collectors, men who moved quietly through alleys, pulling carts laden with bodies, digging pits when cemeteries could no longer suffice, and carrying away the dead whom families could not bury themselves. Their labor was necessary, but it was not honored. It was grim, dangerous, and forgotten in the records, save for brief mentions in chronicles that spoke of mass burials. At first, Constantinople's cemeteries filled more quickly than expected. Graves, once dug individually, were doubled, then tripled. Families buried multiple members together, side by side. Priests prayed over trenches lined with bodies, reciting words so often that they lost their weight. The earth outside the city walls, once used sparingly for burial, was turned over endlessly by shovels, mounds rising and falling as pits were filled. Soon, there were not enough hands. Many who might have dug graves were themselves dead or ill. Others refused, fearful that contact with corpses spread the plague. The state intervened, ordering men, sometimes slaves, sometimes the poor, desperate for coin, to remove bodies and dig pits. Carts rattled through the streets, their wheels creaking under the weight of corpses piled high. Chroniclers wrote that in some places the dead outnumbered the living, so that entire districts echoed only with the sound of cartwheels and shovels. For the corpse collectors, the work was endless. Day and night, They moved through the city, collected from doorsteps where bodies had been left by grieving families too weak to carry them further. They entered houses where entire families lay dead, loading them one by one. In some cases, they found infants crying beside the bodies of their parents, too young to understand, too frail to survive. These too they carried, though not always to graves, sometimes to churches or orphanages, sometimes simply into the pits. The pits themselves grew larger. At first, small trenches were dug outside the city walls. But as the plague continued, officials ordered massive burial grounds, wide open spaces where thousands could be interred together. Chroniclers described bodies stacked layer upon layer, lime poured between them to hasten decay. The air around these pits grew heavy with the smell of death, a stench carried by the wind back into the city. And yet, without this work, Constantinople might have drowned in corpses. The collectors and diggers kept the city moving, however, grimly. They removed the visible evidence of collapse, clearing streets so carts of food could still pass, ensuring the living could still move. But no songs or inscriptions honored them. They were not remembered as heroes, but as shadows, necessary but unwanted, touching death in a way others would not. For the men themselves, fear was constant. Many sickened. Some wore cloths soaked in vinegar over their faces, believing it might protect them. Others carried herbs in their hands, hoping the scent would drive away the corrupted air. Few lasted long. The work consumed them as surely as the plague consumed the city. What lingers in memory is not their names, but their absence from it. We do not know who they were, where they came from, or what they thought as they moved through streets lined with silence. We only know that without them, the empire's capital would have drowned in its own dead. So we leave this opening section with an image. A creaking cart rolling through narrow alleys, piled high with shrouded bodies, heading toward pits dug hurriedly outside the city walls. And we must ask, when even the work of mourning is stripped away, and death becomes a matter of disposal, what does survival really mean? By the height of the plague, Constantinople no longer resembled the shining capital of empire it had once been. To its citizens, it felt more like a vast, open graveyard. Streets that had once echoed with chariot races, market cries, and church bells now carried the endless creak of death carts. The air was thick with the mingled scents of incense, lime, and decay. Priests chanted prayers almost mechanically, their voices hoarse from repetition. And through it all, the gravediggers and corpse collectors labored without pause. At first, their work had been viewed as necessary, but distasteful. Families recoiled from them, avoiding their gaze as carts rolled by. Soon, families depended on them. In a city where entire households vanished overnight, there were often no relatives left to carry bodies to churches. Doors were left ajar, corpses laid out on thresholds so that collectors might remove them quickly. Some citizens hung cloths outside windows, a sign that death had visited, and bodies waited within. Others tied colored rags to doors, hoping collectors would not overlook them in the chaos. The collectors themselves became part of the city's rhythm, a rhythm of despair. They passed daily through districts, their carts filling with the bodies of strangers. Few spoke to them. Children were hushed when they approached. Even priests blessed them from a distance. Yet they were the most visible figures in a time when visibility itself meant survival. The pits outside the city grew wider and deeper. Chroniclers wrote of ditches so large that thousands were buried at once. Bodies were stacked in layers, covered lightly with earth or sprinkled with lime. The sight of them shocked even hardened collectors. Times, the pits overflowed, forcing workers to pile bodies in nearby fields until more earth could be turned. In the heat of summer, The stench carried for miles, seeping back into Constantinople through its gates and alleys. The state, desperate to maintain control, issued orders for systematic collection. Teams of laborers were organized, some conscripted from the poorest quarters, others drawn from enslaved populations. Coins were promised for each body delivered to the pits, though often the payments never came. Even so, hunger drove men to accept the work. Many knew it meant near certain infection, but starvation was certain too. There were, however, limits even to desperation. Some refused outright, fearing divine punishment for handling the dead without proper rites. Priests warned that souls might wander unrested if buried without prayer. To counter this, officials stationed clergy at the pits, where they recited hurried blessings over heaps of bodies. The scale was too vast for solemnity. Whole cartloads were prayed over with a single gesture. The ritual compressed until it was barely recognizable. The people of Constantinople struggled with this erosion of custom. Funerals had been central to family identity. To bury one's kin was an act of love, of duty, of continuity between generations. Now, families were powerless. They watched as their dead were carried away by strangers, mingled with thousands of others, buried in pits without markers. Memory itself seemed to vanish with the shovelfuls of earth. For the gravediggers, the emotional weight was immense. Though we have no surviving records in their own voices, the silence of their anonymity tells its own story. They bore the labor that no one else would bear, moving through a city half dead, their carts rattling behind them. Some lasted only weeks before falling sick themselves. Others survived longer, hardened by necessity. They became familiar with the faces of the dying, with the sight of neighbors who, one day alive, the next day silent, now carried to the pits. And still, the work was endless. The more they dug, the more bodies arrived. The more they carried away, the more streets filled behind them. At times, it seemed as though they were shoveling against the tide of the sea. No matter how wide the trenches, no matter how many carts creaked through the gates, death returned each morning with new demands. It is easy, centuries later, to imagine the empire through its emperors, its generals, and its priests. In these months of plague, it was the forgotten laborers who bore the city's survival. Without them, Constantinople would have collapsed beneath the weight of its own dead, and yet their names were not recorded. Their stories vanished as silently as the bodies they buried. So we pause here, among the pits that widened each day, and ask, when human lives are reduced to numbers and trenches, and the work of mourning becomes anonymous, what remains of dignity and what is left of memory? By the late summer of 542, Constantinople had become a city defined by its dead. The plague, at its peak, claimed thousands in a single day. Chroniclers wrote that corpses lay in houses, in alleys, on church steps, and even along the walls of the hippodrome. Families, too weak or too fearful, could not bury their own. Instead, they waited for the creak of the carts and the faceless men who came to collect what was left of them. The work of the gravediggers and corpse collectors reached its most desperate stage. The trenches outside the city could no longer contain the flood. Each day, carts dumped their loads into pits that filled before nightfall. When ground space ran out, officials ordered burials inside disused towers, cisterns, and even abandoned houses. Entire structures became mausoleums, filled floor to ceiling with bodies stacked in silence. The gravediggers' carts grew heavier. Some carried 50 or more bodies at a time, piled like grain sacks, tied with ropes to prevent them from tumbling into the street. The men strained against the weight, their hands blistered, their faces masked with cloths soaked in vinegar. They worked until collapse, often falling sick themselves. Those who died in service were quickly replaced by others, desperate for coin or simply forced by officials. The plague consumed its own caretakers as readily as its victims. Priests tried to maintain rites, but ceremony shrank under the pressure of numbers. A single blessing was given over hundreds. Incense burned continuously at the pits, though its sweet smoke could not overcome the stench. Lime was scattered, shovelfuls at a time, but the earth could not be turned quickly enough. In places, the soil rose in uneven mounds as corpses pushed upward from shallow graves, forcing collectors to return and rebury what they had already laid down. The city watched all this in numb silence. Where once funerals had been moments of communal gathering, mourning was now fragmented and private. A mother might watch her child taken by cart, unable to follow. A husband might see his wife vanish into a pit where names and faces no longer mattered. The grief of individuals was swallowed by the enormity of collective loss. In this collapse of ritual, memory itself grew thin. Without markers, without names carved into stone, the dead were forgotten almost as quickly as they were buried. Families had no graves to visit, no sites of remembrance. The plague left behind not lines of tombs, but blank fields, unmarked pits, and silence. The collectors and diggers, too, left little trace. They performed the most essential labor of the crisis, but because their work was regarded as unclean, their names were never recorded. They became, like those they buried, anonymous in the historical record, and yet traces of them linger indirectly. We read of the carts, of the pits, of the towers filled with corpses. We read of the lime, the stench, the endless turning of soil. These fragments tell us that someone was there, someone who bore the unbearable burden of removing thousands of bodies from the city. The empire remembered emperors and generals, but these nameless men held Constantinople together when death threatened to bury it alive. When the plague at last began to ebb, the gravediggers' work slowed, but did not stop. Survivors emerged to rebuild, but the city they returned to was altered. Large swaths of land outside the walls were now nothing more than mass graves. Abandoned houses stood as silent ossuaries. The memory of loss was written into the very landscape, and those who had labored most visibly in the crisis faded into obscurity. Their carts gone, their pits filled, their identities erased. The city endured, but it endured scarred. And centuries later, when historians wrote of Justinian's reign, they remembered the dome of Hagia Sophia, the codification of law, the reconquests in the West. They remembered the plague as a catastrophe, but not the men who dug its pits. Their labor was forgotten, absorbed into silence, as though it had never existed. And so we end this story not with triumph, but with absence. The absence of names, of memory, of recognition. And the question lingers: if survival depends on start measure, if survival depends on start measure, because it's gonna be a really good day, because I'm gonna start out by going to Starbucks, but with absence, the absence of Starmex. Those whose labor is never remembered. How much of history is built on silence rather than glory? Asterisk. For centuries, Egypt had been the breadbasket of empires. The Nile's annual flood, rising with steady rhythm, watered the fields, slept behind rich black silt, and ensured harvests that fed millions. Under pharaohs, under Romans, and now under Byzantine rule, Egypt's fields made survival possible for cities far away, especially Constantinople. Every loaf of bread baked in the capital owed its existence to the backs of Egyptian farmers who bent over their fields in the sun. In ordinary years, life along the Nile was defined by the cycle of the flood. Farmers measured its rise with tall stone markers called nilometers, carved with careful gradations. Too little water meant famine. Too much meant destruction. But when the river rose just right, prosperity followed. Men plowed with oxen. Women gleaned in the fields. Children carried baskets of seed. The work was monotonous, backbreaking, but it was secure. The empire's grain fleet depended on it, and the emperor's tax collectors ensured it continued. But in the early 540s, the rhythm was broken, not by the Nile, but by the plague. At first, the fields looked as they always had, green shoots rising against the floodplain, farmers scattering seed. But as the sickness spread from Alexandria inland, villages began to empty. Entire families fell ill, leaving fields untended. A plow might stand abandoned in the furrow, oxen wandering without guidance. Baskets of seed lay unscattered. Tools lay rusting in the soil. In some places, crops sprouted wild, but with no one to reap them, they rotted where they stood. Travelers through the countryside reported silence. Where there should have been the shouts of workers and the laughter of children, there was only the wind over reeds. Houses stood with doors ajar, their occupants dead or fled. Monasteries that once received offerings of grain found their barns empty. Tax collectors arrived to villages, only to find no one left to pay. The empire's dependence on Egypt became a weakness. Without its grain, Constantinople could not be fed. Yet now, when the capital needed food more than ever, Egypt's supply faltered. Ships still left Alexandria, but with smaller loads. Bureaucrats tried to hide the shortfall by adjusting records. The emptiness of the fields could not be concealed. For the farmers themselves, the plague was devastation. Most lived in small mud brick houses, clustered around wells or irrigation channels. Their lives were always precarious. A poor flood, a heavy tax, or a locust swarm could reduce them to hunger. But plague was different. It did not merely reduce harvests. It erased entire households. A village might lose half its men in a single summer. Widows and orphans remained, unable to work the fields. Dependent on charity, that itself vanished. Those who survived faced strange landscapes. Fields once neat and cultivated became overgrown with weeds. Irrigation channels clogged. Gate palms, once carefully pruned, grew wild. The soundscape of rural Egypt changed. Instead of the rhythmic slap of water wheels and the calls of workers, there was quiet, broken only by birds or the rustle of reeds. Survival, once tied to steady communal labor, now depended on chance. Asterix monks in desert monasteries recorded fragments of this transformation. They noted villages abandoned mid-harvest, barns half full, granaries sealed and left to rot. Some wrote that the land itself seemed cursed, though others saw it as divine judgment. For the farmers who remained, explanations mattered little. They bent to their fields if they could, reaping what was left, but the weight of absence was heavy. The empire tried to respond. Officials lowered tax demands in some areas, recognizing that dead men could not pay. In other places, they conscripted survivors to work abandoned fields, though such measures were patchwork at best. Grain shipments continued. The sight of empty fields was more than an economic problem. It was a psychological wound. Egypt had always been reliable. For centuries, the Nile had risen, and men had answered its call. Now, for the first time, its floodplain echoed with silence. The empire that depended on it faced a new truth when the hands that till the soil vanish. No system of law or empire can replace them. We pause here, standing at the edge of an abandoned field where a plow lies rusting in its furrow, and we ask, when the land remains fertile, but the people vanish, what sustains an empire more, the soil itself or the lives that work it? Egypt had always been more than a province. For the Byzantine Empire, it was a lifeline. From its fertile floodplains came the grain that sustained Constantinople's population. a stream of food so dependable that emperors had built entire bureaucracies to manage its flow. Ships loaded in Alexandria arrived like clockwork at the capital's harbors, their cargoes converted into loaves sold cheaply to keep the city's restless masses quiet. For centuries, emperors knew that control of Egypt meant control of survival. But after the plague struck, the reliability of that lifeline faltered. Reports from the Nile Delta spoke of villages reduced to silence. Fields, once lined with workers, stood empty, irrigation channels clogged, water wheels unmanned. A crop could still grow. The Nile's flood had not failed, but there were fewer hands to plant it, fewer scythes to harvest, fewer carts to carry it to the city. Abundance had turned into scarcity, not because the land betrayed them, but because people had vanished. The first to notice were the tax collectors. They traveled their usual routes, carrying scrolls and ledgers, expecting to count sacks of grain and weigh out gold. Instead, they found houses abandoned, barns locked, but empty, and fields lying fallow. Whole villages had disappeared into silence. The collectors recorded what they could, but their reports carried grim news back to Alexandria and Constantinople. Harvests were shrinking, revenues falling, obligations unmet. The shortages rippled outward. In Alexandria, warehouses that once brimmed with grain now showed gaps on their shelves. Ships left harbor with lighter loads. Sailors grumbled about half-filled holds, knowing it meant less pay and greater suspicion from officials in Constantinople. In the capital, the difference soon reached the markets. Bread lines lengthened, loaves grew smaller, and prices rose. For a population already ravaged by plague, hunger deepened despair. The imperial administration scrambled to respond. Orders were issued reducing the tax burden on devastated districts, but these were inconsistently enforced. In some places, governors granted relief. In others, soldiers demanded grain that simply did not exist. The empire's bureaucracy, proud of its efficiency, now stumbled over the simplest fact. Dead men cannot pay, and empty fields cannot yield. Monasteries, often the social safety net of rural Egypt, were strained as well. Farmers who survived brought what little they had to monks, seeking blessings or alms. But monasteries themselves had lost brethren, their barns as empty as the villages around them. Some monks retreated further into the desert, seeing in the devastation proof of divine judgment. Others stayed and did what they could, recording in terse lines the collapse of the countryside. For Constantinople, the crisis exposed the fragility of its dependence. Bread was more than food, it was politics. In the capital, subsidized loaves were central to stability. When the supply faltered, unrest brewed. Crowds muttered against officials, some accusing them of hoarding, others of incompetence. Few in the city fully grasped that the problem lay far away. In Egyptian villages emptied by pestilence, the silence of the fields carried another consequence: the loss of knowledge. Farming in Egypt was not only labor, but tradition, passed down across generations. When families perished, skills perished with them. How to time irrigation, how to care for oxen, how to store grain against a flood. These practical arts were as essential as the soil itself. Their absence left survivors struggling, relearning what had once been second nature to their parents and grandparents. And still, the empire demanded grain. Ships sailed, lighter but not empty, carrying what could be gathered. But each voyage carried with it more than food. Rats fed on whatever grain was stored. Fleas clung to their fur, and sickness traveled with the harvest. The same lifeline that fed Constantinople also carried the plague northward. In this way, Egypt's emptiness was felt twice, once in the hollowing of its villages, and again in the sickness its grain spread to the capital. For the farmers who remained, life grew harsher. They labored not only under the weight of loss, but under the eyes of officials who saw them as the last link in the empire's food chain. Some fled their villages entirely, seeking refuge in monasteries or cities. Others endured, plowing with fewer oxen, harvesting with fewer hands, doing the work of many alone. Their survival kept the empire fed, but at a cost, measured in exhaustion and despair. As the shortages deepened, question echoed from Alexandria to Constantinople. What happens when the land can still give, but there are no people left to receive its blessing? By the autumn of 522, Egypt's fields stood in stark contrast to their usual abundance. The Nile had flooded, as always, spreading its fertile silt across the valley. The soil was rich, the sun unrelenting, the water flowing as it had for millennia. But the human presence that had always answered the river's gift was missing. Farmers were gone. Villages were hushed. Canals clogged and water wheels sat still. Where once thousands bent their backs to the land, now silence lingered, broken only by the rustle of reeds or the lowing of untended cattle. For centuries, the empire had assumed Egypt's constancy, until it was unthinkable that the breadbasket might fail. Even in years of bad flood, grain had always come. But now, it was not the river that failed, but the people themselves. With so many farmers dead, the empire's supply lines faltered. Ships still sailed, but with half-empty holds. Granaries in Alexandria stood with gaps where once they overflowed. The long chain that carried grain from rural fields to imperial bakeries was broken at its very first link. The impact in Constantinople was immediate. Bread prices rose, lines stretched longer, and anger grew. Citizens, already shaken by the plague, now faced hunger. The cheap bread distributions that emperors had relied on to maintain public peace were disrupted. Rumors spread that officials were hoarding grain or that corrupt merchants were profiteering from scarcity. Crowds gathered outside bakeries, muttering against the government. In a city still burying its dead, the threat of food riots loomed. The state responded with the tools it had. Troops were stationed at granaries. Edicts fixed bread prices. Specters patrolled markets. But such measures only managed appearances. The underlying truth that there was less grain because there were fewer farmers could not be changed by decree. The empire could command ships and soldiers, but it could not resurrect the dead in Egypt itself. Famine struck hardest at the survivors. With so many fields abandoned, harvests shrank. Villagers ate what they could. Fish from the Nile, dates from wild groves, whatever grain remained in old stores. But as months stretched on, even these ran out. Some resorted to eating fodder meant for animals. Monks recorded with sorrow that widows and children starved at monastery gates, begging for food that the monks themselves no longer had. The famine deepened the psychological toll of the plague. For farmers who had survived the sickness, there was bitter irony. They had escaped death by fever, only to face death by hunger. They stood in fields that should have yielded plenty, yet could not reap enough without neighbors, kin, and community. Survival, once a shared rhythm of labor, now became lonely endurance. Beyond Egypt, the empire strained under the consequences. Provinces that relied on Egyptian grain felt the shortage keenly. Cities in Syria and Anatolia reported hunger. Even the army suffered. Campaigns stalled as supply lines dried up. Soldiers mutinied when rations failed. The great reconquests that Justinian had dreamed of victories in Italy and beyond were slowed not only by plague, but by empty stomachs. The empty fields of Egypt became a symbol of fragility. As chroniclers later wrote of villages swallowed by weeds, of irrigation canals, dry and cracked, of barns where rats fed freely on uncollected grain. These images haunted the empire's memory. For centuries, emperors had believed their authority rested on law, army, and faith. But the plague revealed something deeper, that power itself depended on humble farmers whose labor under the Nile sun had always been taken for granted. When the plague finally loosened its grip, Egypt began to recover, but the scars remained. Villages repopulated slowly, fields were reclaimed inch by inch, canals were dredged, and life returned in fragments. But the memory of silence, of fields, fertile yet empty, lingered. The empire would never again look at Egypt with quite the same certainty. Its dependence had been revealed as vulnerability. For Constantinople, the lesson was bitter. Bread was more than sustenance. It was the glue of empire, the daily assurance that the system still held. And when the loaves grew smaller, when hunger joined death, the illusion of invulnerability. So we close this story with the image of the Nile, still rising faithfully, still blessing the soil, yet flowing past fields where no one comes to harvest. And the question remains, what sustains an empire longer, the gifts of the earth, or the fragile lives of those who labor to gather them? The Mediterranean in the 6th century was not merely a sea, it was the highway of empire. Its waters connected distant provinces, carried armies and goods, and bound together lands that would otherwise have been isolated. For Byzantium, it was the stage on which commerce, faith, and politics all played out. Ships moved constantly between Egypt, Syria, North Africa, Italy, and Constantinople. And on those ships, unseen in the shadows, the plague traveled too. Merchants were its first messengers. Even in times of sickness, trade could not simply stop. Grain had to be shipped, spices demanded markets, and silk from the east fetched high prices in the capital. Merchants risked their lives to keep goods moving, and in doing so, they carried more than cargo. When their ships docked, they brought with them rumors, anxieties, and often infection. A feverish sailor stumbling down a gangplank could pass the plague into a new city before a single crate was unloaded. The harbors of Antioch, Gaza, and Caesarea were among the first to feel the impact. Sailors from Alexandria, already weakened by sickness, brought news of whole villages emptied along the Nile. Within weeks, dock workers in these Syrian ports began falling ill themselves. Markets thinned, caravans hesitated, and the lively rhythm of trade slowed to a tense stillness. Chroniclers in Antioch recorded strange swellings, sudden deaths, and fear spreading faster than the disease itself. From there, the plague traveled westward. Merchants carried it into Cilicia, into Cyprus, into the Aegean islands. Each voyage that once promised wealth now risked contagion. Some traders fled commerce altogether, retreating inland. Others pressed on, hoping profit outweighed danger. But rats scurrying in their holes and fleas clinging to their clothes ensured that the plague did not care for human calculation. Alongside the merchants were the monks. The Byzantine world was dotted with monasteries, from the deserts of Egypt to the islands of the Aegean. Monks traveled constantly, carrying letters, seeking spiritual teachers, or delivering relics. Their journeys were quieter than those of merchants, but no less significant. In times of crisis, people often turned to monasteries for prayer and aid. But as monks wandered from one community to another, they, too, carried the sickness. Often unknowingly, in some accounts, monasteries became refuges, their walls offering protection from the chaos of cities. But in others, they became epicenters of contagion. A single monk, infected on the road, might bring the plague into a cloister of dozens. Entire communities of ascetics, once isolated in devotion, were decimated. Desert monasteries reported silence, where once psalms had echoed, cells left empty, chapels abandoned. Merchants and monks together created a web of movement that tied the empire together and now unraveled it. For centuries, their travels had been sources of strength. Merchants in rich cities with foreign goods. Monks enriched souls with prayers and guidance. But in the years of the plague, their very mobility became danger. The empire struggled to control this movement. Some ports tried to impose restrictions, turning away ships rumored to carry sickness. Others demanded that travelers remain outside city walls 4 days before entering. But enforcement was uneven, and desperation often outweighed caution. Food had to arrive. Letters had to be delivered. Pilgrims still sought shrines. And so the plague flowed on, slipping through gaps in human control. What makes this moment striking is how ordinary it seemed at first. Merchants did what they had always done: sold goods, exchanged coins, told stories of distant places. Monks did what they had always done: prayed, traveled, offered counsel. Nothing outwardly changed in their roles. Only the unseen presence of disease turned these familiar patterns into instruments of devastation. By the time Constantinople felt its full force, the Mediterranean was already threaded with infection. From Alexandria to Antioch, from Cyprus to Cilicia, from Gaza to the Aegean, the plague had woven itself into the fabric of travel. It did not need armies or decrees to move. It needed only the everyday journeys of those who tied the empire together. We pause here, standing on the deck of a merchant ship, sailing quietly through calm waters, its cargo holds filled with grain and cloth, its crew whispering of sickness in Egypt. The sea is blue, the wind steady, the voyage ordinary, and yet, in the shadows below deck, death waits to make landfall. And the question lingers, when the very movements that sustain an empire also spread its ruin, how can the line between survival and collapse be drawn? Asterisk. In the 6th century Mediterranean, ports were the lifeblood of commerce. Antioch, Caesarea, Gaza, Cyprus, and countless smaller harbors lined the coast, each a node in the empire's vast web of exchange. Every arrival meant new goods, new letters, and new voices. But as the plague spread outward from Egypt, these same ports became gates of infection. In Antioch, one of the empire's largest cities, the arrival of 6 sailors coincided with the bustling festival season. Crowds filled the markets. Pilgrims crowded churches, and merchants haggled over wares from distant lands. The first deaths went unnoticed among the ordinary churn of fevers and illnesses that accompanied any large gathering. But soon, patterns emerged: swollen lymph nodes, high fevers, delirium, sudden collapse. The city that had survived earthquakes and invasions now confronted a new enemy, one that no wall or garrison could repel. Markets emptied, ships avoided its harbor, and Antioch streets echoed with the same silence that had already fallen. On Alexandria, Cyprus, smaller but crucial as a stopover, faced devastation as well. Its ports received ships bound north to Constantinople or west to the Aegean. Each vessel carried not only cargo but sickness. Chroniclers later noted that entire coastal villages were reduced to silence, their harbors filled with anchored ships that no one dared approach. The plague did not need to conquer through armies. It conquered through proximity, through fleas carried ashore on ropes and rats slipping into warehouses. The inland routes carried it further. Caravans that once transported spices, silk, and ivory from the east now became unknowing couriers of contagion. Merchants moved along the old roads through Syria, Cilicia, and Cappadocia, stopping at caravansaries where goods and stories were exchanged. The plague moved with them from one way station to the next, carried on clothing, cargo, and skin. Villages far from the sea, which once believed themselves sheltered from maritime threats, now found themselves entangled in the same web of death. And then there were the monasteries. These communities, scattered across deserts, mountains, and islands, were both refuges and risks. For many, monasteries became the first place to seek help when plague struck. The sick were carried to their gates, hoping for prayer, healing, or burial. Monks, bound by vows of charity, received them, but in opening their doors, they welcomed the plague within. Accounts speak of monasteries in Egypt where entire brotherhoods vanished. Silence replaced the chanting of psalms. Chapels stood empty, and cells became tombs. In Syria, letters between monasteries suddenly ceased. Not because of neglect, but because the men who once carried them had died. In the Aegean Islands, where monks had fled for solitude, the arrival of a single infected traveler could erase years of devotion in weeks. The paradox of monks as carriers is striking. They traveled with no intent to profit. Unlike merchants, they sought holiness, not trade. And yet, their devotion to hospitality, their duty to pray for the sick, made them just as vulnerable and just as dangerous as conduits of plague. A wandering ascetic, infected but not yet bedridden, could unknowingly carry the pestilence from one cloister to another, linking isolated valleys and remote mountains into the chain of contagion. The empire noticed, but could do little. Officials tried to impose quarantines at ports, ordering ships to remain at anchor before unloading. Some monasteries attempted isolation, closing their gates to outsiders, but the measures were uneven, and often too late. Food still needed to be traded, prayers still offered, goods still exchanged. Commerce and faith alike were too central to life to be halted entirely. In this way, the plague spread, not as a wave that crashed suddenly, but as ripples that moved outward, quietly and steadily, from Alexandria to Antioch, from Cyprus to Cappadocia, from desert monasteries to coastal cloisters. The network of empire became the network of infection. And so, we pause here, at the threshold of a monastery in Syria, where a weary monk welcomes a stranger carrying both hum. By the middle of the 6th century, the Mediterranean had become a mirror of the plague's reach. Every port, every road, every monastery bore its mark. The same sea that had once been celebrated as Mare Nostrum, our sea, now seemed less like a source of wealth than a net that ensnared the empire in sickness. Merchants continued to sail because they had to. Grain, olive oil, and wine remained necessities. Spices, silk, and luxury goods still promised profit. To halt trade entirely was unthinkable, and so ships left Alexandria, Antioch, and Gaza, their sails catching the wind as always. But each voyage brought new outbreaks. Dockworkers in Cilicia fell sick. Sailors in Rhodes carried infection inland. From port to port, the disease leapt, invisibly, carried in fleas, hidden in bales of cloth, and rats slipping ashore at night. No place was too remote. Even small islands, once thought of as sanctuaries, became infected. Monks who had fled there for solitude found their chapels echoing with silence as plague entered through a single visitor. Coastal monasteries, once known for their hospitality, now feared their own openness. In some places, monks barred their gates entirely, isolating themselves in an attempt to outlast the sickness. Others kept their vows, welcoming the sick until they themselves fell. Entire communities vanished, their memory preserved only in the absence of their voices in letters and chronicles. Caravans fared no better. The overland trade routes that linked the eastern provinces carried more than silk and incense. Each stop at a caravanserai, each exchange of goods, risked infection. Fleas moved as easily along desert roads as they did across the sea. Villages far from the coast, once thought safe from maritime contagion, soon found themselves emptied. A traveler from Antioch might bring the sickness to Cappadocia. A monk from Palestine might carry it into Cilicia. The empire's interconnectedness, once its pride, now became its peril. For ordinary people, the consequences were bewildering. Sickness appeared in places where no ship had docked, no stranger had lingered. Families asked, how could a disease reach so far, so quickly? The concept of invisible transmission was unknown. Many concluded it was divine punishment, spreading without need of human carriers. Others blamed corrupted air or bad grain. Few could imagine that rats and fleas, so familiar and so small, were the true agents. The government tried to intervene, but its reach was limited. Ports issued decrees against ships from Egypt, but food shortages forced them to relent. Soldiers were stationed at caravan routes, but they could not stop the unseen. Priests preached repentance, but repentance did not halt fevers. The plague moved as it pleased, ignoring borders, garrisons, and edicts alike. And yet, even as it spread, life continued. Ships still sailed. Markets still opened, though with fewer goods. Monks still prayed, though their choirs were smaller. Trade and devotion did not vanish. They weakened, faltered, and resumed in fragments. The plague had not destroyed the empire's networks. It had revealed their fragility in the long memory of Byzantium. This lesson lingered. The empire's strength had always been its interconnectedness. Ports, roads, monasteries, and markets binding distant provinces into one. Those same threads, when touched by sickness, carried ruin as quickly as they once carried prosperity. The Mediterranean, once a source of pride, became a reminder of vulnerability. Centuries later, when other plagues returned, chroniclers remembered these years. They spoke of ships that brought both food and death, of monks who carried both prayers, and pestilence of caravans that bore both silk and sickness. They remembered that strength and weakness were inseparable, that the networks which sustained life could just as easily deliver death. And so we close this story with the image of a ship gliding across calm waters, its sails full, its crew weary, its cargo rich, and in its shadows the unseen presence of plague. And the question remains, can any empire, however mighty, ever escape the dangers woven into the very fabric of its own connections? Asterisk in Constantinople, bread was more than food. It was stability, politics, and survival. For centuries, the empire had ensured a steady distribution of loaves to its citizens, a continuation of the Roman grain dole. Each morning, queues of people stretched outside bakeries and distribution points, waiting for their daily ration. A single loaf, baked from Egyptian grain and sold at a fixed, subsidized price, meant not just nourishment, but the reassurance that the empire still functioned. As long as bread remained affordable, riots could be contained, patience could be preserved, and faith in the emperor maintained. But in 542, when plague hollowed the empire's lifelines, bread itself became uncertain. Grain from Egypt arrived, in smaller quantities, ships lighter than before, warehouses less full. The city's granaries, once brimming, began to show gaps. Bakers, who measured out their flour with precision, now worked with less. Loaves shrank in size, prices crept upward, and the lines outside bakeries grew longer, more restless. For the citizens of Constantinople, this was not simply inconvenience. To them, bread was a daily ritual, a promise from emperor to people. When that promise faltered, fear spread. Mothers worried for their children, workers muttered against officials, and rumors filled the markets. Some claimed that corrupt merchants hoarded grain for profit. Others whispered that the plague itself had poisoned the bread. Still others insisted that God had withdrawn his blessing from the city. The government responded with edicts. Prices were fixed by law. Hoarding was declared a crime. Inspectors patrolled bakeries, ensuring loaves were sold at the mandated weight. Yet enforcement proved difficult in a city staggering under sickness. Bakers themselves fell ill there. Ovens cold. Inspectors vanished from their posts. The system that had once run with precision faltered. And so, in districts hardest hit by plague, people began to improvise. Families stretched what bread they had with lentils, beans, or millet. Some baked coarse loaves at home from whatever scraps of flour remained, producing bread so heavy and bitter that it barely nourished. Others turned to substitutes, porridge, boiled weeds, or thin soups. The absence of bread, once unimaginable, became daily reality. The poorest suffered most. Without steady wages, without land, they relied entirely on the subsidized dole. When supplies dwindled, they had nothing to fall back on. Crowds gathered at distribution points, not just waiting, but demanding. Chroniclers wrote of scuffles, of mothers fighting for loaves, of guards forced to disperse crowds with threats of violence. Hunger joined plague, each amplifying the despair of the other. For bakers, life grew perilous. They faced not only shortages of flour, but also the anger of citizens who saw them as gatekeepers of survival. Some were accused of hiding grain, others of cheating customers. A few were dragged from their shops and beaten. Yet, many bakers, like their customers, were victims themselves, struggling to keep ovens lit when flour ran low, when apprentices died, when plague carried off their families. The symbolism of bread deepened the crisis. In Christian Constantinople, bread was not only daily sustenance, but sacred. The Eucharist, celebrated in churches across the city, used bread as the body of Christ. When bread became scarce, even liturgy was affected. Priests lamented their inability to obtain fine wheat flour for holy use. Some resorted to coarser grain, others to smaller portions. Worship itself seemed touched by scarcity, as though the city's very relationship with God was diminished by empty granaries. And yet, even in scarcity, the empire clung to the ritual. Loaves continued to be distributed, however small. Officials worked desperately to ensure that grain ships, however reduced, kept arriving. For rulers knew what history had already taught. When bread vanished, unrest followed. In Rome, centuries earlier, food shortages had sparked riots. In Constantinople, the threat was the same. To lose bread was to risk the unraveling of civic order itself. The memory of this scarcity lingered long after the plague's first wave receded. Citizens remembered the sight of half-loaves, of queues stretching endlessly, of children crying at empty tables. They remembered the bitterness of substitutes, the anger of crowds, the cold ovens of silent bakeries. Bread, once a daily certainty, had become a symbol of fragility. We pause here, in a narrow street where a line of citizens waits before a bakery, their eyes hollow from hunger, their loaves smaller than ever. The smell of baking still drifts faintly, but it cannot mask the emptiness of stomachs. And the question remains, when even bread, the most basic promise of empire, begins to fail, how long can faith in order survive? By the second year of plague, Constantinople's relationship with bread had changed from trust to suspicion. No longer the simple daily assurance of continuity. Each loaf now represented conflict between citizens and officials, between hunger and authority, between survival and collapse. Prices, though officially fixed, began to fluctuate in practice. The imperial edicts decreed that bread must remain affordable, sold at the same subsidized price as before. But in markets across the city, bakers, merchants, and middlemen struggled to comply. Grain was scarcer. Shipments from Egypt arrived sporadically. Flour mills stood idle when their workers died or fled. Bakers, who once produced hundreds of loaves a day, now managed only dozens. And so, quietly, loaves grew smaller and coarser. sold with nervous excuses to waiting crowds. Citizens noticed. They weighed loaves in their hands, muttered at their diminished size, and accused bakers of deceit. Some insisted that officials had stolen flour, pocketing grain meant for the people. Others claimed bakers mixed sawdust or sand into their bread. Rumors fueled more by fear than reality. What mattered was not truth, but perception. In a time of hunger, suspicion flourished. The government responded with harsh measures. Inspectors raided bakeries, seizing loaves deemed to light. Penalties included fines, public humiliation, and even corporal punishment. But punishment could not conjure flour from empty warehouses. Every crackdown deepened resentment. The bakers protested that they could only bake with what they were given. Citizens countered that hunger did not wait for explanations. The cycle of anger continued, feeding unrest as surely as bread once fed the belly. Meanwhile, bread became political. Justinian, recovering from his own bout of plague, recognized that control of food was control of the city. He ordered new shipments from Anatolia and the Black Sea, desperate to supplement Egypt's failing supply. Grain convoys were escorted by soldiers, their arrivals celebrated as though they were military victories. Each loaf distributed was framed as imperial generosity, a sign that the emperor still provided. But the people, remembering days when bread was plentiful without spectacle, knew the difference. For ordinary families, bread dictated daily choices. A laborer might spend half his wages on a few coarse loaves. Mothers stretched crumbs into soups, softening them with water to feed children. Some scavenged weeds or boiled grass when bread ran out, returning to bakeries in hope the next day. Hunger gnawed at the rhythm of life. In poorer districts, fights broke out in bread lines. Guards were posted to maintain order, their presence a reminder that food had become as contested as gold. Chroniclers describe crowds that surged so fiercely that people were trampled in their desperation for loaves. The plague had made death common, but hunger made desperation visible. Even the church was touched by scarcity. A priest, requiring bread for communion, faced shortages. Priests reduced portions, sometimes breaking one loaf into pieces, so small that congregants received only crumbs. For worshippers, the sacrament still carried meaning. But the shrinking bread was a stark reflection of daily reality. Even the sacred had been diminished by famine. Amid this desperation, profiteers emerged. Some merchants hoarded grain, selling it secretly at inflated prices. Others diluted flour with cheaper ingredients, producing loaves that barely sustained. Officials condemned such practices as sin and treason, but enforcement was uneven. Times of scarcity, greed found fertile ground. The poorest, however, had no access to black markets. They depended entirely on the state's distribution. When their loaves shrank, they shrank too. Emaciated figures became common in the streets, their ribs visible, their movements slow. Plague killed quickly. Famine killed slowly, but no less cruelly. And so bread became not only food, but symbol. A loaf in one's hand meant survival, however temporary. An empty hand meant despair. The empire's power, so often displayed in mosaics, armies, and monuments, was now measured in loaves handed out. At dawn, and every morning, the same question lingered in the lines outside bakeries. How long could the emperor keep this fragile promise? And how many loaves remained before silence replaced the smell of baking bread? By the peak of the plague, Constantinople was not only a city of the dead, but a city of the hungry. Its streets, once loud with the calls of merchants, echoed instead with the mutterings of queues that wound before bakeries and distribution points. The plague had emptied workshops and households, but hunger gnawed at the survivors. To them, a single loaf of bread mattered more than all the emperor's laws. armies, or conquests. The granaries told the truth before anyone else admitted it. Where once they overflowed with Egyptian grain, their bins now showed gaps. The clerks, who measured and sealed the stores, counted less each week. Their ledgers recorded the decline in stark columns. Sacks halved, carts, fewer loaves, diminished. Egypt's fields had emptied, and with them the capital's stomachs. Queues grew restless. Mothers clutched children who cried for food. Men grumbled at bakers who handed out smaller loaves, accusing them of theft. Guards stood nearby, spears in hand, not against enemies at the gate, but against citizens at the oven door. Chroniclers wrote of scuffles that turned deadly, of citizens crushed in surges toward bread stalls, of soldiers striking those who tried to seize more than their share. Rumors fanned the flames. Some said the emperor hoarded grain in secret warehouses. Others swore that rich families had private supplies, while the poor starved. In a city where plague had already leveled distinctions between rich and poor, in death, hunger sharpened them. Again in life, to stand empty-handed in a bread line while another carried loaves away was to feel injustice as sharp as famine itself. The government fought back with spectacle. Justinian ordered convoys from Anatolia and the Black Sea. Their arrival staged as triumphs. Soldiers escorted wagons through the streets. Grain sacks displayed like trophies. Loaves were handed out at public ceremonies. The emperor cast as a provider. But the people knew the difference between abundance and performance. A loaf once given daily without drama now arrived wrapped in ceremony and smaller than ever. Some bakeries closed entirely, their owners dead or fled. Others remained open, only under guard, their ovens producing loaves in guarded batches. Citizens who had once strolled to buy bread now approached in fear, unsure if they would return with food or empty hands. Hunger made patience thin. Riots loomed too many. It seemed as though bread had become the final thread holding the city together. The hippodrome was silent, the markets thin, the harbors nearly still. Even the emperor had nearly fallen. Only the morning distribution of loaves, however shrunken, however bitter, gave Constantinople its rhythm. Without it, despair might break into open chaos. The symbolism stretched beyond survival. In Christian liturgy, bread was the body of Christ offered at the altar as sacred nourishment. Now, even this was strained. Priests tore smaller and smaller pieces from the Eucharistic loaf, dividing it among congregants. The shrinking fragment mirrored the shrinking daily bread, both sacred and ordinary reflecting the same truth. Scarcity defined every corner of life, and yet the city endured. Not without loss, not without hunger, but it endured. Loaves were baked, queues formed, distributions continued. Each loaf that passed from oven to hand was more than sustenance. It was an act of fragile continuity. Proof that order had not fully collapsed. When the plague finally loosened its grip, when the worst passed, the memory of hunger remained. Citizens remembered the bitter taste of coarse bread, the emptiness of long queues, the fear that each day's loaf might be the last. Bread, once so ordinary, never again seemed certain. And so we close this story with the image of a single loaf, passed from baker to hungry hand, in a city where silence, sickness, and hunger threatened to dissolve all order. And we are left to wonder, was it armies and emperors that preserved the empire? Or was it the humble, fragile ritual of bread, the last thread of life in a city starved by pestilence? the Byzantine world, the deserts of Egypt and Syria were not empty. They were dotted with monasteries, small clusters of mud brick cells, stone chapels, and date groves where monks withdrew from the world to pray. Too many in the empire. These communities were seen as pillars of holiness, places where the prayers of the few sustained the many. When plague descended on the empire, it did not bypass these deserts. It reached them through travelers, merchants, and pilgrims, and it left behind traces not in grand chronicles, but in the quiet fragments of monastic records. Life in these monasteries had always been defined by rhythm. At dawn, monks gathered to chant psalms. Tea, worked in gardens, copied manuscripts, wove baskets, and prayed in silence. Meals were sparse: bread, dates, and lentils shared in refectories. Nights were long, often filled with prayer. Its rhythm had endured for generations, surviving political upheavals, wars, and shifting empires. But the plague was different. It interrupted not only life, but the very silence that defined monastic devotion. At first, monasteries served as refuges. Villagers fled there when their homes emptied, seeking prayers or shelter. The monks received them, bound by duty to hospitality. But with guests came infection. A single visitor, fevered but still walking, could bring sickness into a community that lived in close quarters. Sin cells that had once been filled with psalms echoed with coughing. Chapels that had once rung with voices fell quiet as monks collapsed. Some monasteries attempted isolation. Gates were barred, visitors turned away, letters left unanswered. Yet even within, sickness spread. Monks shared water jars, bread, and mats. Their vow of communal life, once strength, became vulnerability. In records that survive only in fragments, we find notes of entire communities disappearing, and abbots, name recorded without successor. A manuscript half-copied, the handwriting breaking off mid-page, margins filled with short, grim lines, and many brothers died this year. The desert itself bore witness. Wells went untended, gardens overgrew, date palms dropped fruit no one collected. Pilgrims who later passed by wrote of monasteries standing empty, doors swinging in the wind, icons fading in chapels where no candles burned. The silence of these places was different from their old contemplative quiet. It was not chosen solitude, but absence, an absence that told of lives cut short, prayers left unfinished, and yet traces remained. Surviving monks sometimes continued their work of writing, leaving behind records of plague years. Their words are sparse, more factual than emotional, but in that very sparseness lies their power. The brothers fell ill. One line reads, another, the harvest was left in the fields. These are not the words of emperors or generals, but of men who measured history not by battles, but by bread, prayer, and silence. The empire rarely noticed the loss. Constantinople mourned its own dead, worried over bread prices, watched the emperor's health. The silence of a monastery in the desert barely registered at the center of power, and yet, in their own quiet way, these places recorded what the plague meant. Far from the capital, villages without farmers, fields without laborers, cloisters without voices. When later historians pieced together the story of Justinian's plague, it was not only imperial chronicles they read, but these fragments from monasteries. They are understated, but they reveal the depth of the crisis. They remind us that the plague was not confined to cities, that it reached the quietest corners of the empire, silencing even those whose lives were devoted to silence itself. We pause here, in the cool shadows of a desert chapel, its walls lined with fading icons, its benches empty, its psalms unspoken. The silence is heavy, not with prayer, but with absence. And we are left to ask, when even silence itself is silenced, how does memory endure? in the bustling streets of Constantinople. The plague was recorded with drama. Chroniclers, like Procopius, described bodies stacked in houses, pits filled with corpses, and even the emperor himself struck down. But in the desert monasteries of Egypt and Syria, the record of the plague was different. It was not loud, not elaborate, but quiet and brief notes left in margins, half-finished manuscripts, terse annals written by weary hands. 4 monks.